So there's a lot of discussion right now about free speech in the U.S. And the way that it will go is somebody will usually say, I support free speech, and then they'll add a conjunction. They'll say, but I do not support the right to incite violence, or I don't support the right to say something racist, or to say something hurtful, or to say something bigoted, or I support free speech, but the right to free speech doesn't give you the right to be free of accountability. And so if you say something and then, a private company decides that they no longer want to allow you on their platform, that's not a free speech issue. That's just an accountability issue. And an interesting thing has been that most of these new reinterpretations of what free speech means, as to encompass a less broad definition that's less inclusive and more restrictive, has been coming from the left, quote unquote, or people who self-identify as on the left. Which is interesting because traditionally the left was the faction of the political spectrum that has been the biggest defenders of the broad definition of free speech for reasons that I think are obvious, and were the ones that originally fought for those rights in the first place back in the 60s and 70s. And so I thought this would be a good opportunity to compare the leftists of the past and their rationale for defending free speech as they saw it with the new, what I would describe as feckless, spineless, unstrategic, self-defeating interpretations of free speech, which have arisen on the left in recent years. And so the best example that I can think of to illustrate just how divergent the current views of free speech are with what they traditionally were is the Stokey, Illinois case with the ACLU being the American Civil Liberties Union. And so Stokey, Illinois, I think this was in the late 70s or early 80s, I forget the specific year, but Stokey, Illinois is a town outside of Chicago, with a very high proportion of not just Jewish people, but also literal Holocaust survivors. So people that came out of Auschwitz with tattoos on their arm from being in literal concentration camps. And a neo-Nazi group decided that they wanted to do a rally within within Stokey, Illinois. And understandably, there were a lot of people that were against the idea of literal Nazis, like not just, people that are called Nazis on Twitter by leftists because they are wearing Trump hats or going to a Proud Boys rally, but actual Nazis with swastikas hailing Hitler, of them holding a rally a few decades after the Holocaust in a town with people that were literally in concentration camps in Europe that had their family exterminated by that same exact ideology. A lot of people were against that, understandable. And the rationale that they had in opposing the right of those Nazis to rally are the ones that we can think of. That, first of all, that it would incite violence, that this was a violent ideology that had literally killed millions of people, including the family members of the people within this town, as well as it's extremely insensitive and hurtful and obviously racist, and it doesn't get much worse than literal Nazis walking in a town of Holocaust survivors. However, the ACLU, as well as other leftists, as well as civil rights leaders, were able to take the longer term view and realize that if the government was allowed to come in and subvert the right of these individuals from expressing their political views peacefully, again, this is what they were doing. They weren't targeting any one person specifically, and they weren't inciting violence in that manner, which is something that is viewed as being restricted speech, in my view, correctly. But rather, they were saying their specific political ideology, walking through a town, waving flags and signs, not hurting anyone specifically. If the government was allowed to come in and undermine that free speech, then a precedent would be set up in which they could undermine any other free speech. And the ACLU itself was also largely funded and founded by American Jews, including Holocaust survivors, that understood that if this precedent was allowed to establish itself, it would inevitably come back and target the most maligned, marginalized groups within society, which is precisely what happened in Europe, in terms of restrictive measures on the civil liberties of Jews within Germany, to assemble, to voice their political opinions, to hold rallies, and on and on and on. And so even if in this instance they're vehemently opposed to the right of these Nazis, they understood that it would inevitably come back and target the same people that it's said to be protecting in this instance. Civil rights leaders understood the same thing. Actually, the same laws which the government was using or trying to cite, or the same legal arguments that this would incite violence were the same arguments that that governments in the South during the 60s and 70s had used as to why to stop civil rights demonstrations. They said that these would incite violence. And the strategy that the government will use and has used over and over again in order to reduce civil liberties for people and restrict what people are able to do in protesting the government is they'll pick the most repugnant views within society, like literal Nazis that want to walk through a Holocaust town, and they'll say, look at these people. They want to use their free speech rights to walk around with flags that are, Nazi flags saying Hail Hitler, and there's a bunch of Holocaust survivors here. We have to stop them. We have to reduce their rights. And the people, if they're not thinking straight and they're following the current doctrines of leftists on Twitter who want to really ruin everything, they'll say, absolutely, take their rights away from them. We have to stop this. And then as soon as you blink again, they'll use those same precedents to restrict the rights of civil rights leaders who want to protest the government's, discriminatory policies. And they've done this over and over again. Brandenburg versus Ohio was a case in which a Klansman wanted to hold a cross burning on his private property, and the state wanted to come in and say, no, you're not allowed to do this. This is harmful speech. It's harmful to black people. It's harmful to Jewish people. It's harmful to it incites violence on the aggregate. We need to suppress it. And civil liberties organizations, as well as the Supreme Court, said, sorry, if we preclude this person to demonstrate his political views peacefully on his own property, because he wasn't causing any violence during the act. He wasn't rioting or throwing rocks at people or hurting anybody specifically, and he wasn't even targeting anybody specifically. He was just saying his general political ideology. If we allowed the state to censor and suppress that on the basis of public safety, then now there's a precedent that's set up which could be used and will be used and has been used historically against many, many other groups, traditionally the marginalized ones, the powerless ones that are trying to take on the establishment, which traditionally comes from the left. The same thing happened during the Bush administration. I remember there was a case that the Bush administration brought against the Westboro Baptist Church during the early years of the Iraq War, where the Westboro Baptist Church being that group headed by Fred Phelps that went to the funerals of soldiers who died in Iraq and said that they died because God hates fags. And so the left hated that because it was extremely anti-gay. The right hated that because it was disrespecting our soldiers. Everybody hates the Westboro Baptist Church, but fortunately, the ACLU and other civil liberties groups, as well as the Supreme Court, sided against the Bush administration and said that, sorry, this is protected speech. They're assembling peacefully. They're not targeting anybody individually, and if we say that their views are so repugnant that the state's allowed to censor them, then, the precedent's been set that the state will use against everybody. And as I mentioned, they've used it against the civil rights movement. They used it against the labor movement during the 1920s, during the first Red Scare. They used it to imprison Eugene V. Debs and label everybody as communist, and we have to suppress communism, so we have to crush the labor movement, and that's what Woodrow Wilson did to crush dissent for World War I. They did it during the McCarthyite era and the second Red Scare, because if you can label somebody as if communism is the most evil thing, and these people are sympathetic to communists because they say positive things about the labor movement, or they have this or that view, then now all of a sudden we can subvert those views which are antagonistic to business, which is beneficial for the establishment. They'll do it for the anti-war movement. The whole entire free speech movement during the 60s and 70s on college campus was intimately intertwined with the opposition to the Vietnam War and opposition to Richard Nixon, who was kind of an authoritarian figure. And so the left has always understood that this is going to be used against them. But now all of a sudden, these woke leftists on Twitter with no understanding of anything outside of, how tweets make them feel in the moment, are trying to completely undermine what is the cornerstone bedrock value of a free society, which leftists has fought for generations. And so now the position of most leftists today is, look at all these inaccurate, harmful things that are being said on all these various platforms, on social media platforms. Look at Alex Jones. He's tweeting that, Obama smells like sulfur because he's a demon, and, the chemicals are turning the frogs gay, and, that Sandy Hook was a inside job, and, conducted by crisis actors. And these views are inaccurate and harmful, and they're hurting the parents of the victims of Sandy Hook. And so therefore, because they're harmful, we need to deplatform this. We can't allow this type of misinformation, this type of fake news and this type of speech to be allowed to propagate any further. And leftists are like, oh yeah, no, we should absolutely do that. And they don't understand that by supporting that type of restriction and that type of deplatforming, they are creating the precedent by which these same social media companies will say that views which are outside of the mainstream orthodoxy, which are by definition almost the traditional views of the left, if the left is the people who are antagonistic to power and challenging the orthodoxies of the day, that views that are outside the views of permissible political discourse, whether it's Sandy Hook denialism or some racist comments over here, or whether it's Palestinian activism or calling for the breaking up of social media conglomerates over here, which is, they've already seen leftist groups become censored because they're viewed as fake news. That's inevitably going to be used to target the left and to suppress free speech in the long run. And when a mainstream outlet says something which is wrong, or says something that's inaccurate, or calls for something which could incite violence, which happens every single day, just read the op-eds of the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post, and they'll say, we need to take action against Iran. We need to support Netanyahu further. We need to support multinational corporations as they outsource jobs and thereby continue the extraction of resources in third world countries, which leads to violence and civil wars. These are all things which have real consequences for people's lives and are actually inciting violence. But it's just because they're permissible, because they're within the mainstream, because they're what everybody thinks, then they'll be allowed. Like if the New York Times wants to lie us into a war by printing Judith Miller columns straight from Dick Cheney's mouth about how there's weapons of mass destruction in Iraq that Saddam is hiding, they'll do that day after day after day. They'll start a war. Hundreds of thousands of people will die. We'll still have those repercussions later. ISIS will come through. The whole Middle East is destroyed. That's a lot of problems that were caused by those lies, that fake news, and by those the violence that spewed from it. Is anybody calling for the New York Times to be deplatformed? Is anybody calling for them to be censored? No, nobody's calling for that, because the New York Times is the establishment, and they would never go after the mainstream. But it's just that these views are the orthodox views, which would never be challenged. But the ones that are viewed as from the outside will be. And once the precedent becomes established that we can censor these views over here from Alex Jones, then the anti-war movement's next, then comes the labor movement, then comes the civil rights movement, then comes anybody who has views which are outside of the mainstream, and the battle's already been lost. So this new left-wing idea that these companies aren't just platforms which allow for the free distribution of ideas in a way that would allow them to be debated within the public square, and for ones which are correct to be supported, and ones that are incorrect to be criticized, and thereby that's how we move society forward, which has always been the traditional view. They're not that anymore. Instead, they should actually be monitoring the speech and regulating who uses their platforms is like totally incoherent. Like, is anybody calling on AT&T to cancel telephone calls and regulate, their telephones just because there might be some Nazis that are, calling on the phone to each other and thereby planning rallies in that way? Or maybe Alex Jones is talking to Milo Yiannopoulos. Like, should we start regulating AT&T? No, nobody thinks that we should. AT&T is not the problem in that regard. There are other problems associated with AT&T and their distribution of satellites and their monopolization of the telecom industry. But in terms of being a neutral platform, that's not when that comes in. It's good that that people are allowed to access that, and how they use it is not the problem of the platforms themselves. Same thing goes for readership of these news outlets. Like people, like the left called on the censorship of that New York Post article about Hunter Biden right before the election, even though the New York Post is the fourth biggest newspaper outlet in the world, and nothing that was said in there was proved to have been manufactured. Now, there could have been inaccuracies, it could have been not perfect reporting, but as I already mentioned, that happens all the time within the mainstream outlets. The reason that it was taken down is because it went against the orthodoxy of the liberal executives within Silicon Valley who were supportive of Biden at the time, and so therefore it was censorship. But nobody's arguing that the New York Post, which is a paper, is traditionally like a printed paper, that we should also be targeting the trucks, which are distribute the truck companies which are leased out to distribute those things, because effectively they're doing the same things on the ground that the social media companies are doing electronically, which is just allowing for the distribution of that information. It's not the Trump company's fault what the New York Post says or doesn't say. It's not the social media company's fault, and the regulation of that is authoritarian in nature and totally counterproductive.